It was so fast that Owain had no chance to do anything but counter the strokes. I remembered Owain's scornful description of Arthur's fighting style. "Slashing like a haymaker," Owain had said, "hurrying to beat bad weather." Once, and only once, did Arthur whip his blade past Owain's guard, but the blow was half parried, robbing it of force, and the sword was checked by the iron warrior rings in Owain's beard. Owain threw the blade off, then tried again to drive Arthur down onto the ground with the weight of his body. Both fell, and for a second it looked as though Owain would trap Arthur, but somehow Arthur scrambled away and climbed to his feet. Arthur waited for Owain to rise. Both men were breathing hard, and for a few seconds they watched each other, judging their chances. And then Arthur moved forward into the attack again. He swung again and again, just as he had before, and again Owain parried the wild blows. Then Arthur slipped for a second time. He called in fear as he fell, and his cry was answered by a shout of triumph as Owain drew back his arm for the killing blow. Then Owain saw that Arthur had not slipped at all, but had merely pretended it to make Owain open his guard, and now it was Arthur who lunged. It was his first lunge of the battle, and his last. Owain had his back to me, and I was half hiding my eyes so that I would not have to see Arthur's death. But instead, right before me, I saw the shining tip of Howlbane come clean out through Owain's wet and blood-streaked back. Arthur's lunge had gone straight through the champion's body. Owain seemed to freeze, his sword-arm suddenly powerless. Then, from nerveless fingers, his sword dropped into the mud. For a second, for a heartbeat, Arthur left Howlbane in Owain's belly. Then, with a huge effort that took every muscle in his body, he twisted the blade and ripped it free. He shouted as he tore that steel out of Owain, shouted as the blade broke the flesh's suction and ripped through bowel and muscle and skin and flesh, and still shouted as he dragged the sword out into the day's grey light. The force needed to drag the steel from Owain's heavy body meant that the sword kept going in a wild backswing that sprayed blood far across the mud-churned circle. While Owain, disbelief on his face and with his guts spilling into the mud, fell. Then Howlbane thrust down once into the champion's neck, and there was silence in Caer Cadern. Arthur stepped back from the corpse. Then he turned sunwise to look into the faces of every man around the circle. Arthur's own face was hard as stone. There was not a scrap of kindness there, only the face of a fighter come to triumph. It was a terrible face, his big jaws set in a rictus of hate, so that those of us who only knew Arthur as a painstakingly thoughtful man were shocked by the change in him. "Does any man here," he called in a loud voice, "dispute the judgment?" None did. Rain dripped from cloaks and diluted Owain's blood as Arthur walked to face the fallen champion's spearmen. "Now's your chance," he spat at them, "to avenge your lord. Otherwise, you are mine." None could meet his eye, so he turned away from them, stepped over the fallen warlord and faced Tristan. "Does Kurnow accept the judgment, Lord Prince?" Tristan, pale-faced, nodded. "It does, Lord." "Sahid," Arthur decreed, "will be paid from Owain's estate." He turned again to look at the warriors. "Who commands Owain's men now?" Griffith ap Annan stepped nervously forward. "I do, Lord." "You will come to me for orders in 1 hour, and if any man of you touches Derval, my comrade, then all of you will burn in a fire pit." They lowered their gaze rather than meet his eyes. Arthur used a handful of mud to clean the sword of its blood, then handed it to me. "Dry it well, Derval." "Yes, Lord." "And thank you. A good sword." He closed his eyes suddenly. God help me, he said, but I enjoyed that. Now, his eyes opened. I've done my part. What about yours? Mine? I gaped at him. A kitten? He said patiently. For Sarlina? I have one, Lord, I said. Then fetch it, he said, and come to the hall for breakfast. Do you have a woman? Yes, Lord. Tell her we leave tomorrow when the council has finished its business. I stared at him, hardly believing my luck. You mean, I began. I mean, he interrupted me impatiently, that you will serve me now. Yes, Lord, I said. Yes, Lord. He picked up his sword, cloak and boots, took Sarlina's hand, and walked away from the rival he had killed. And I had found my lord. Lunette did not want to travel north to Corinium, where Arthur was wintering with his men. She did not want to leave her friends, and besides, she added almost as an afterthought, she was pregnant. I greeted the announcement with disbelieving silence. You heard me, she snapped. Pregnant? I can't go. And why should we go? We were happy here. Owain was a good lord, then you had to spoil it. So why don't you go by yourself? She was squatting by our hut's fire, trying to take what warmth she could from its feeble flames. I hate you, she said, and she vainly tried to pull our lover's ring from her finger. Pregnant? I asked in a shocked voice. But maybe not by you, Lunette screamed, then gave up trying to tug the ring off her swollen finger, and hurled a billet of firewood at me instead. Our slave howled in misery at the back of the hut, and Lunette threw a log at her for good measure. But I have to go, I said. I have to go with Arthur. And abandon me, she shrieked. You want me to be a whore? Is that it? She hurled another piece of wood, and I abandoned the fight. It was the day after Arthur's contest with Owain, and we were all back in Lindinnis, where the Council of Dumnonia was meeting in Arthur's villa, which was consequently surrounded by petitioners with their relatives and friends. Those eager people waited at the villa's front gates. At the back, a huddle of armories and storehouses stood where the villa's garden had once grown. Owain's old warband was waiting for me there. They had chosen the site of their ambush well, at a place where holly trees hid us from the buildings. Lunette was still screaming at me as I walked up the path, calling me a traitor and a coward. Well, she's got you right, Saxon, Griffith ap Annan said, then spat towards me. His men blocked my path. There were a dozen spearmen there, all old comrades, but all now with implacably hostile faces. Arthur might have placed my life under his protection, but here, hidden from the villa windows, no one would know how I had ended up dead in the mud. You broke your oath, Griffith accused me. I did not, I claimed. Minak, an old warrior whose neck and wrists were heavy with the gold given him by Owain, levelled his spear. Don't worry about your girl, he said nastily. There's plenty of us who know how to look after young widows. I drew Howlbane. Behind me the women had come from their huts to see their men avenge the death of their lord. Lunette was among them, and jeering at me like the rest. We've taken a new oath, Minak said, and unlike you, we keep our oaths. He advanced down the path, with Griffith beside him. The other spearmen crowded in behind their leaders, while at my back the women pressed closer, and some of them put aside their ever-present distaffs and spindles to begin throwing stones to drive me forward on to Griffith's spear. I hefted Howlbane, its edge still dented from Arthur's fight with Owain, and I said a prayer that the gods would give me a good death. Saxon, Griffith said, using the worst insult he could find. He was advancing very cautiously, for he knew my skill with the sword. Saxon traitor, he said, then recoiled, as a heavy stone splashed into the mud on the path between us. He looked past me, and I saw the fear come onto his face, and the blade of his spear drop. Your name's Nimui's voice hissed from behind me. Are on the stone. Griffith ap Annan, Mapon ac Elkid, Minak ap Cadan. She recited the spearmen's names and ancestry one by one, and each time she pronounced a name, she spat towards the curse stone that she had lobbed into their path. The spears dropped. I stood aside to let Nimue pass. She was dressed in a black hooded cloak that cast her face into a shadow, out of which her golden eye glittered malevolently. She stopped beside me, then suddenly turned and pointed a staff, dressed with a sprig of mistletoe, towards the women who had been throwing stones. You want your children turned into rats? Nimue called to the onlookers. You want your milk to dry, and your urine to burn like fire? Go! The women seized their children and ran to hide themselves in the huts. Griffith knew Nimue was Merlin's beloved, and possessed of the druid's power, and he was shaking with fear of her curse. Please, he said, as Nimue turned back to face him. She walked past his lowered spear point and struck him hard on the cheek with her staff. Down, she said. All of you. Down. Flat. On your faces. Flat. She struck Minak. Get down. They lay on their bellies in the mud, and one by one she stepped on their backs. Her tread was light, but her curse heavy. Your deaths are in my hand, she told them. Your lives are all mine. I will use your souls as gaming pieces. Each dawn that you wake alive, you will thank me for my mercy, and each dusk you will pray that I do not see your filthy faces in my dreams. Griffith ap Annan, swear allegiance to Derval. Kiss his sword. On your knees, dog. On your knees. I protested that these men owed me no allegiance, but Nimue turned on me in anger and ordered me to hold out the sword. Then, one by one, with mud and terror on their faces, my old companions shuffled on their knees to kiss the tip of Howlbane. The oath gave me no rights of lordship over these men, but it did make it impossible for any of them to attack me without endangering their souls, for Nimue told them that if they broke this oath, their souls were doomed to stay forevermore in the dark otherworld, never to find new bodies on this green, sunlit earth again. One of the spearmen, a Christian, defied Nimue by saying the oath meant nothing, but his courage failed when she prized the golden eye from its socket and held it towards him, hissing a curse, and, in abject terror, he dropped to his knees and kissed my sword like the others. Nimue, once their oaths were sworn, ordered them to lie flat again. She worked the golden ball back into her eye socket, and then we left them in the mud. Nimue laughed as we climbed out of their sight. I enjoyed that, she said, and there was a flash of the old childish mischief in her voice. I did enjoy that. I do so hate men, Derval. All men. Men in leather, carrying spears. She shuddered. Not you, but the rest I hate. She turned and spat back down the path. How the gods must laugh at little strutting men. She pushed back her hood to look at me. Do you want Lynette to go to Crinium with you? I swore to protect her, I said unhappily, and she tells me she's pregnant. Does that mean you do want her company? Yes, I said, meaning no. I think you're a fool, Nimue said, but Lynette will do as I tell her. But I tell you, Derval, that if you don't leave her now, she'll leave you in her own good time. She put her hand on my arm to check me. We had come close to the villa's porch, where the crowd of petitioners was waiting to see Arthur. Did you know, Nimue asked me in a low voice, that Arthur is thinking of releasing Gunlius? No. I was shocked by the news. He is. He thinks Gunlius will keep the peace now, and he thinks Gunlius is the best man to rule Siluria.